It began with a sound, low, grumbling, unnatural, as if the ocean itself were growling. Japanese soldiers, crouched behind bunkers on a sun-bleached island in the central Pacific, waited. They had rehearsed this moment 100 times. First would come the bombardment, then the landing craft, then wave after wave of Americans charging across the shallows, exposed, vulnerable. It was a sequence they believed they could break, but when the surf broke that morning, something else emerged. Monsters, not ships, not men, steel, lurching, snarling, crawling across the water as if it were land. Squat, armored, alive. Tracked vehicles, their hulls hissing with salt spray, slammed over coral reefs like they were paper. Painted in dull shades of gray and green, their turrets spun, their guns roared. They crushed through tank traps, tore through sandbanks, and kept moving forward. Impossible machines breathing fire. The defenders froze. These beasts weren't supposed to exist. In Japanese war doctrine, the sea was a barrier, natural and absolute. It was a front line no armored vehicle could ever cross. Their plans were designed around that belief, their fire zones pre-sighted, their machine guns and howitzers angled to kill infantry wading through open water. Not this, not armor crawling directly from the surf and slamming into their defenses without warning. Disbelief turned to panic. Their bunkers, built to repel foot soldiers, now faced the grinding steel thunder of amphibious war machines, land vehicles tracked, LVTS, or as the Marines called them, Amtracks. The ocean had betrayed the defenders. It no longer kept the enemy at bay. It carried him in steel waves of armor, fire, and fury. What began as a routine landing now felt otherworldly, and in that moment the Japanese knew they weren't ready. Florida, the 1930s, swamps thick with cypress roots and mosquitoes buzz beneath a sun that cuts through dense green wilderness like a blowtorch. Hurricane season lashes coastal towns every year, drowning highways and turning roads into rivers. For most people, it's a hazard. For one man, it's a challenge. Donald Roebling wasn't a soldier. He wasn't part of any military think tank or general's war room. He was an inventor, yes, but of a particular kind. Rich, eccentric, visionary. The grandson of the man who built the Brooklyn Bridge and the son of industrial genius. Donald had inherited more than wealth. He'd inherited a craving for innovation. His eyes weren't on Europe or rising tensions in the Pacific. They were fixed on the Gulf Coast, on saving lives from nature's fury. He called it the alligator. It didn't look like much. A boxy, lumbering, tracked vehicle designed to move through flooded terrain. No armor, no weapons, just steel and flotation and stubborn power. Its purpose? Civilian rescue. To pull people trapped by hurricanes out of mud marsh and rising water when boats couldn't risk the tides and vehicles couldn't pass flooded roads. It was brilliant, and nobody noticed at first. But halfway across the world, storm clouds of another kind were forming. The Japanese Empire was fortifying island after island, building concrete bunkers, beach defenses, and layered kill zones across the vast Pacific. If war were to come, and by the late 1930s that seemed inevitable, America would eventually face a battlefield unlike anything it had encountered. Islands without ports, fringed by coral reefs, and guarded by fanatical defenders waiting for men to wade ashore. The Marines knew this, and they had a problem. By 1940, whispers about Roebling's machine began circulating among military strategists. A tracked vehicle that could swim, could it carry men through surf, over reefs, straight into battle? To most, the suggestion was absurd, ridiculous even. This ungainly swamp cruiser wasn't armor, it wasn't war-ready. But to a few visionaries in the Marine Corps, it was a spark, a possibility. Trials began in secret. Roebling himself joined the effort, modifying and improving his machine. The Navy and Marine Corps were skeptical. The vehicle was slow, thin-skinned, civilian. But it could do one thing no other machine in America's arsenal could. It could beat the ocean. In 1941, the U.S. Navy greenlit a contract. The Food Machinery Corporation, FMC, was given the task of turning a hurricane rescue craft into a machine of war. Steel replaced aluminum. Open cargo areas became troop compartments. Engines were reinforced. Weapon mounts added. Testing expanded. The civilians working shoulder to shoulder with officers knew what was coming, even if the rest of the country didn't. Pearl Harbor validated their urgency. America was at war. And thousands of miles away, the Japanese were digging in. There would be no friendly ports, no easy landings, no gentle beaches. If America wanted to strike back, it would need to attack the most dangerous part of an island head-on, the shoreline. And that meant landing under fire, on reefs, in shallow lagoons, across terrain designed to kill. Higgins boats could get close, but not close enough. They'd get stuck on reefs, and Marines would have to jump out into waist-deep water, exposed, slow, helpless targets. Roebling's redesigned Alligator offered an alternative: power through surf, grind over coral, crawl up beaches, and keep going. In training exercises, some officers laughed at it. "Looks like something out of a comic book," one colonel remarked. But after the first few tests, the laughter faded. It worked. Not perfectly, not yet, but it worked better than anything else. And then something remarkable happened. The same officers who had dismissed the LVT began to ask, what if we made it stronger? What if we armed it? What if this thing could not only carry Marines to the beach? What if it could fight? Nobody had expected a machine like this would be needed, but the Pacific wasn't Europe. There were no roads, no rail lines, just waves, reefs, heat, and the enemy. For the first time, the battlefield would require a machine bred not for elegance, but survival. Donald Roebling had built a lifeline for hurricane victims. Now he had given the Marine Corps the one thing it needed to survive what came next, a way forward where none existed. And soon his creation, the LVT, the Amtrak, would be put to the ultimate test, not in Florida's swamps, but in blood-soaked coral at a place called Tarawa. And this time, people wouldn't just be watching, they'd be riding inside. By early 1942, war in the Pacific was no longer a distant storm. It was a daily, grinding reality for the U.S. Marines. The initial landings had proven something more terrifying than Japanese machine guns or artillery. The ocean itself was killing them. At islands like Tulagi and Guadalcanal, American troops climbed down rope ladders into bobbing landing craft, packed shoulder to shoulder, trusting plywood hulls to carry them close enough to disembark. But close never seemed to be close enough. Coral reefs, sandbars, and shallow surf stalled the boats hundreds of yards from shore, and there in waist-deep water, burdened with gear, the Marines had to walk the final stretch. Exposed, slow, soaking wet, and under fire from defenders who knew exactly what path they'd take. The Pacific wasn't Europe. There were no wide beaches, no ports, no flat coasts where tanks and trucks could easily roll in after the infantry. Each island was a fortress, a ring of coral circled by deep blue sea and clad in iron and concrete. The traditional approach? Suicidal. The Higgins boat, iconic, dependable, and legendary, had helped deliver troops under fire during amphibious operations, but its flat bottom made it prone to grounding on reefs and shoals. When the tide was low, Marines got stuck. When the tide was high, they were still within range of enemy gunners. By the end of Guadalcanal, officers had seen enough. They needed something else. A machine that wasn't just a boat, but a vehicle. Something that could push beyond the surf, that could move like a tank, float like a boat, and handle terrain where neither belonged. Something that had never existed before. The Marines needed a monster. Enter the Food Machinery Corporation. FMC didn't make tanks or weapons. They made citrus processing machines. But after Roebling's bizarre swamp alligator proved capable of crossing terrain no other craft could negotiate, the company found itself thrust into one of the most critical engineering efforts of the entire war. And time was running out. The LVT-1 landing vehicle, tracked, was the first true variant. Its steel tracks, shallow draft, and open cargo well made it ideal for beach landings. But it was still unarmed, a gamble. Some commanders doubted it could carry men through fire. Others believed it was the only shot they had. FMC engineers worked through nights and weekends. They weren't just building machines, they were creating survival. Designs changed constantly. New grousers to improve traction on soft sand, reinforced hulls to withstand waves, engine tweaks to increase reliability in salt air. Every bolt, every weld, every decision was tested under simulated battlefield stress. Because the battlefield wasn't theoretical, it was already being lost. Meanwhile, intelligence reports painted a clear picture. The Japanese had fortified atolls like Tarawa and Kwajalein with anti-tank guns, machine gun nests, and networks of bunkers made to funnel invaders into concentrated kill zones, and the only way to overcome them was to land directly on top of them, fast, armored, and unexpected. One Marine lieutenant, after seeing the LVT in action for the first time, said, "It moves like a barge possessed, ugly as Satan. Exactly what we need." The order was made. The Navy would take Roebling's rescue vehicle and, with FMC, turn it into a weapon. As the first production models rumbled onto flatbeds and rolled toward the docks bound for the Pacific, a quiet understanding gripped those who built them. If these machines failed, Marines would die by the thousands. The Amtrak wasn't like a typical vehicle. It wasn't powered by glory. It was powered by desperation. They didn't know exactly when it would be used, but they knew this. The moment these vehicles hit the beach, there would be no second chances. The Pacific wasn't forgiving. The reefs didn't care. And the enemy wasn't going to wait. Something new had to change the rules. A war machine that made its own path, served its own purpose, and didn't ask permission to exist. The next battle would be the proving ground. And the LVT, it would either change amphibious warfare forever, or vanish, another failed experiment swallowed by the tide. At dawn on November 20th, 1943, the Pacific didn't look like a battlefield. It looked like paradise. Turquoise waters lapping gently against coral reefs. White sand stretched around a tiny speck of land called Baitio in the Tarawa atoll. Palm trees swayed lazily inland. But beyond that postcard image, hidden behind reinforced bunkers and buried steel, waited more than 4,000 well-armed Japanese defenders. Fanatics, dug in, surrounded by barbed wire, seawalls, machine gun nests, and artillery that had been precisely zeroed in on a single point, the shallow waters no man was supposed to survive crossing. From the ships offshore, U.S. Marines could see their target, just 800 yards away. What they couldn't yet see was the reef. A jagged, sprawling coral death trap stretching hundreds of yards out to sea. A natural barrier that would ruin everything. The plan assumed high tide would rise enough to float the Higgins landing craft right up to the beach. But the tide didn't cooperate. The Higgins boats slammed against the coral, stuck. Marines began climbing over the sides into chest-high water. Japanese gunners opened fire instantly. It was a slaughter. But something else was already in motion, a new weapon, a gamble. From deeper offshore Amtracks, more than 100 landing vehicles tracked, plunged into the surf. No other vehicle in human history had ever done what they were about to attempt. The LVTS hit the reef, crawled over it, not stopped, not delayed. They climbed it. With their long, flat-bellied armored hulls and screaming engines, they churned across what was supposed to be impassable. Riders inside held their breath as bullets sparked off thin metal walls. Some Amtracks blew apart mid-surf, others caught fire, spun in the water, or sank. but dozens kept charging forward, creating gaps in Japanese fire that gave the following waves a fighting chance. Inside the LVTS, it was hell. Water sloshed at their feet, sticky with blood. Engine fumes filled the air. Japanese fire pinged off rivets inches from their heads. One Marine later recalled, "It sounded like gravel being thrown at a tin can. Then something exploded, and half the guys were just gone." But those vehicles, those floating alligators, kept going. They didn't stop on the beach. They didn't unload and retreat. They rolled past the surf, over the sand, into the Japanese perimeter. One LVT drove straight through a barbed wire barrier and deposited Marines onto the lip of a pillbox, just as grenades exploded inside. They fought while still disembarking. Some of the LVTS had .30 or .50 caliber machine guns mounted and returned fire, suppressing enemy positions long enough for their cargo to scramble into cover. But they weren't invincible. As the tide rose, more waves of Marines came in boats. They hit the reef, got caught, and were torn apart walking inland on foot. Their blood stained the water crimson. Above it all, the Amtracks roared, burned, broke down, and crawled forward anyway. By the end of the day, the sand was littered with steel corpses, charred wrecks of LVTS, cratered and gutted. Many had been hit multiple times. In one photo taken the day after the assault, a line of burnt Amtracks lies mangled along the beach, a twisted mechanical path carved out of the kill zone. But those wrecks had made all the difference. For the first time, American forces had landed on a reef-protected island under full frontal fire and lived to breach the defenses. There was no other machine in the U.S. military's arsenal that could have made that possible. The Amtracks had carried Marines directly into the fight, across the most dangerous 600 yards on Earth, and saved lives by absorbing punishment meant for flesh and bone. The Japanese had never imagined this. In their minds, the ocean was a moat, a weapon. The invader would die in the surf, crawling on foot under machine gun fire. That was the plan. That was the assumption. But when they saw armored, fire-spitting monsters driving up the beach from the sea, slamming into bunkers, crushing wire, and ignoring obstacles, they were shaken. One captured Japanese sergeant would later say, "We thought the Americans had brought tanks on boats, but the tanks could swim." Tarawa was won barely after 76 hours of non-stop, brutal combat. Over 1,000 Marines dead, nearly 3,000 wounded, but without the LVTS, those numbers might have doubled, maybe worse. It was the bloodiest assault the Marine Corps had ever attempted until that point. And it was also the turning point, because now they knew for certain that the LVT worked. The Amtrak wasn't theory anymore. It wasn't a test bed. It was a combat-proven war machine. The Pacific had just witnessed something impossible. Steel armor crawling from the sea, changing the rules of war. And this was only the beginning. Tarawa had screamed a single bloody truth into the ears of military planners. The LVT had not just worked. It had saved lives. But it had also revealed exactly where the creature was still weak. Thin armor, open cargo holds, no rear exit, vulnerable to virtually every heavy weapon the Japanese could bring to bear. The Amtrak had proven itself in fire, and now it demanded evolution through flame. The message echoed back across the Pacific, reaching factory floors and drawing boards. Engineers at the Food Machinery Corporation didn't have the luxury of theory anymore. They had Tarawa's wreckage, photos of charred LVTS, spent shells that had punched clear through the hull, and first-hand accounts from surviving Marines who'd been lucky enough to live through the baptism. They didn't need blueprints. They had battlefield scars. The LVT-2 was the first answer. Bigger engine, reinforced hull, more reliable suspension. It could carry more Marines, more gear, and, most critically, it could keep up with the speed of assault. But evolution didn't stop at armor and horsepower. Then came the breakthrough, the LVT-4. On the outside, it looked similar. But inside, it was revolutionized. Instead of clambering over the sides, which made troops vulnerable as they disembarked, the LVT-4 featured a rear ramp, a deceptively simple invention that shaved vital seconds off landing time. It meant Marines could run, not climb. The difference between life and death, between a smooth landing and a firing squad. And yet, the transformation wasn't limited to transport. Some LVTs didn't just deliver Marines, they fought with them. The LVTA-1 rolled into production with a small cannon mounted on top. The LVTA-4 followed with a powerful 75mm howitzer in a rotating turret, essentially a swimming tank capable of softening up pillboxes and coastal defenses even before the boots hit the sand. These weren't passive transports. These were floating fire bases, moving guns strapped to buoyant steel that crawled across the surf and opened fire at point-blank range. The effect was immediate at Saipan, at Tinian, at Guam. Amphibious assaults changed forever. No longer did infantry have to knock out bunkers with grenades from the shoreline. They had mobile artillery with them in the water, supporting them as they stepped into the fight. The Japanese were stunned once again. Their anti-boat doctrine was now entirely ineffective. Barbed wire and reef traps? Irrelevant. Their forward gun emplacements, carefully arranged to cut down unarmed landing troops, were now the first targets of American vehicle-mounted guns. The siege was no longer on land alone. The war had entered the water. This was the battlefield adapting in real time. Combat wasn't just telling commanders what was needed, it was screaming it. And the U.S. responded fast. Factories back home were retooled. Assembly lines stepped into overdrive. Each new LVT that rumbled off the line carried more upgrades, more armor, more firepower. Some were converted into ambulances, others into command posts, mortar platforms, or flamethrower carriers. The LVT was no longer a single-purpose machine. It had become a family of beasts, each evolved for a specific island, each designed for one mission: get through the surf and win. It was war by adaptation, survival by redesign. And every model that crawled off those ships toward Japanese-held beaches carried within it a simple, unspoken promise. This time, it's not just about getting ashore. This time, we're coming with teeth. June 1944. The Pacific trembled with thunder as hundreds of American ships closed in on the Marianas, their destination, Saipan. Inside the hulking transports, Marines waited in silence, fingers gripping rifles, knees bouncing with nerves. The order came down, a signal repeated across the fleet, and then the water erupted. Wave after wave of LVTs stormed the surf like a steel tide, not dozens, hundreds, each one carrying men, supplies, weapons, some with turrets, others with artillery, some just packed wall to wall with ammo and canned food. The shoreline didn't stand a chance. Saipan's reefs couldn't stop them. Its beaches couldn't hold them. Still, the defenders struck. Japanese artillery opened fire from concealed bunkers built into the hills. Machine guns stitched the surf. LVTs exploded mid-wave. Some burst into flame, others rolled on, trailing smoke like unstoppable beasts charging into hell. Marines leapt into the water and crawled behind burning wreckage for cover. Many were cut down, but many more lived, because the Amtracks took the beating for them. A floating rifle company commander later said, "We lost 8 out of 12 vehicles in our wave, but we got across." Without the tracks, none of us would have made it. When Marines fought their way inland, the LVTs didn't vanish. They returned through fire, retrieved wounded, delivered mortars, food, radio towers, bridging the critical gap between the sea and the battlefront. Then came Peleliu, September. The beaches were nightmare fuel, covered in jagged coral, mined to the teeth. Japanese defenders had learned from Tarawa. Their gunners waited for the LVTs this time. The assault was brutal. Many Amtracks never reached shore. Some sank before their ramps even opened. Survivors fought through smoke and fire just to reach dry land. Yet even amid such chaos, the machines played roles they weren't designed for: ambulances, ammo carriers, fire support. One captain commandeered a nearly destroyed LVT to evacuate wounded Marines from the beach. Japanese snipers fired relentlessly as bullets tore through its sides. The driver bled out during the return trip, but he kept the engine running long enough to reach a hospital ship. Some call Peleliu a mistake, others call it a grind. For the LVTS, it became a crucible, evolved under fire, tested to destruction, and still faithful. 3 months later, on the shores of Guam, the pattern repeated. Amtracks leading the charge, crawling over reefs. Their tracks melted from heat and friction. Some carried flamethrowers. Others acted as direct fire support, spraying bunkers with .50 caliber fire before the first Marine stepped on sand. The defenders were stunned by the speed and ferocity of the landings, every beachhead contested, yet overwhelmed. Inside the chaos, LVTS moved like lifelines. Some ran relays back and forth 30 times a day over enemy shell and surf, hauling water and food to exhausted troops. One gunner called his LVT a battered coffin, but never left it. And then came the monster of them all, Okinawa, April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. Over 1,200 LVTS surged toward shore, steel giants moving in formation across crashing waves. This time, there were AVS fitted with rocket launchers, 75mm howitzers, and flamethrowers. Others were assigned purely to evacuate casualties. A few carried entire command centers, communications hubs, floating alongside the battle. The Japanese had prepared kill zones deeper inland, expecting another Tarawa, a bloody surfline assault. What they got was a force that landed almost untouched thanks to the sheer scale and shock of the LVT advance. Beach obstacles crumbled. Heavy equipment rolled ashore on tracks instead of feet. One LVT alone delivered 2 tons of ammo and evacuated 12 wounded Marines in the same run. But Okinawa didn't stay calm. By week 2, Japanese artillery had found its range. LVTS were hit in droves. Shattered on beaches, they became improvised cover. Crews camouflaged their tracks, smeared mud on their armor, tied palm leaves to their turrets. Some even deployed smoke screens, coughing chemicals into the air as they shuttled loads across the kill zones. At night, engines roared beneath the stars. Marines called them ghost tanks, crawling across black water in silence to reach forward lines. They were more than vehicles now. They were a symbol of continuity, of steady hands and steel hearts. Wherever the Marines went, the Amtracks followed, or, more precisely, led. They had become the first wave, the supply train, and the last ride home for the dying, all in one. And for the Japanese, the pattern was clear. These weren't just machines, they were the tide. And the tide was rising. They called them sea turtles at first, strange, crawling shapes, breaching the surf, shrugging off waves as though they didn't belong to this world. At Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and Okinawa, Japanese defenders watched the impossible unfold, armored vehicles swaying with the tide, climbing over coral reefs, smashing into bunkers, and delivering soldiers straight into the heat of battle. This wasn't how the war was supposed to be fought. The Pacific was meant to stop armor. Its reefs were natural kill zones, its beaches death traps. Japanese doctrine relied on one unshakable assumption: the ocean was a wall that no machine could breach. They were wrong. Captured Japanese diaries after the war revealed raw emotion, panic, confusion, disbelief. They moved from the ocean like monsters, one officer wrote, not ships, not tanks. Something between another recalled spraying his machine gun at empty water, only to discover the Americans had already arrived, wrapped in steel, weapons firing, tracks churning in the sand. There had been no plan for this, no defense, no answer. Even when LVTS were knocked out, their psychological weight endured. The enemy believed more were coming, always just beyond the waves, and they usually were. The monster they never saw coming didn't slither through the jungle. It crawled out of the sea. When the war ended, the LVT faded from headlines, but it never disappeared. Cold War militaries took notice. Amphibious tactics were rewritten. From the jungles of Vietnam to the shores of Iraq, new generations of tracked amphibians, descendants of Roebling's rescue vehicle, followed the same path from water to war. But none would carry the same shock. None would emerge the way the Amtrak did in 1943, out of the waves, in fire and steel, rewriting the rules of battle, and proving that in war's most desperate moments, survival doesn't come from strength alone. It comes from imagination.